This evening we are to consider something about the nature and function of the human will. This subject has fascinated human beings since they first discovered that they could determine something and almost irresistibly continue in this determination until they attained their goal or destroyed themselves in the attempt. In early times, men thought of the will as a special faculty or power. Some held that it was derived from deity. Others that it represented the power of evil in man. It seemed that in the human will rested the power of disobedience. The person could will against the common good. He could shake his fist like the fabled Persian emperor against heaven. And he could relentlessly pursue his own objectives, regardless of consequences or cost to those around him. The power of the will frightened most members of primitive society, and they attempted to discipline it, control it, work with it as though it was actually an independent organ of power. Hume and Spinoza, however, were closer to the fact, for they realized that the will represents merely the pressure of what we might term the subjective personality. The individual's willing, so to say, is always more or less the expression of his immediate conviction or his immediate interpretation of the kind of circumstance which he wishes to bring about. Will, then, is an intense form of wishing. It is a wish supported by the resources of the mind, and in exploring the nature of will function, we are impressed with the fact that it usually represents a faculty of selection or of choice. Will usually means that the individual selects from several possible courses of action, one which he relentlessly pursues. Thus, in will itself, there is a certain selectivity, or appears to be. Perhaps we would be more correct if we pointed out that this selectivity is nothing but the expression of the dominant experience patterns in that person. The will must therefore always proceed from the degree of integration which the person possesses. For the majority of individuals, will is not strong because certainties are not strong within that person. Will to operate must be comparatively unclouded. It must have very little sense of division within its own nature. It must not reflect upon alternate courses of conduct, nor must it weigh carefully several probabilities. The moment the individual divides his attention or suspects that the contrary to his present course would be a better course, the will is vitiated. The individual is no longer sure of himself. Therefore, the power of will has to depend to a certain degree upon the power of egoism. The individual must think of himself as a being capable of willing. He must also, to some degree, assume that whatever his own will determines must be important, at least for him. He cannot will intensely if his objectives are unimportant or insignificant to himself. Nor can he sustain will with a good spirit unless he is confident that his own course has some peculiar merit or advantage. Will can very often be an intensely selfish instrument. For will most commonly presses upon the individual the urgency of doing that which he most desires to do. Thus we must recognize that will has a relationship to desire, that it has to do with the fulfillment of some subjective intensity of purpose. The individual is willing to fulfill some pressure within his own nature. As one individual expressed it, will is the intense determination of the person to do exactly what he intended to do. This is not far from the fact, because without this intensity of intention, we would not find the operation of the will nearly as effective. In working with the human being, we are also inclined to notice that intensive willfulness is often associated with adolescence. The mature person is less likely to be willful than the immature person. The reason being that the mature person, confronted with a wide area of experiences, is less certain of his own intention. The longer we live, the less certain we are of most things. The more experienced we are, the less confident we are in our own judgment in all matters. And as we proceed along the course of intelligence, we begin to recognize that there are many different contributing factors which we do not fully understand. A person who has only one idea is therefore most likely to be highly willful in the matter of that idea. If, however, he has a wide area of interest, his intensity will be decreased. Most strong-willed persons in history have been individuals comparatively uninformed. They have been certain because they did not know. Certainty is easiest where man's experience of life is least adequate. Certainty is most certain where ignorance prevents us from considering opposite possibilities. The person who has great, intense, enduring self-opinion, who is consistently certain that he knows and is right, will very often become extremely willful. And in these instances, obstacles are entirely misunderstood. Instead of the obstacle causing the individual to question himself, it causes him to cast himself against the obstacle, always determined to break through. Thus, the individual frequently breaks through patterns of law and order, and crime is greater among persons who are very intense in their will procedures. We like to think of some people as strong-willed and others as weak-willed, but we have no evidence that the factor of will itself is either strong or weak. We are more inclined to assume that the so-called strong-willed person is simply one whose intensity sustains the pressure of his own will procedure. That it is not that the will is stronger, but that the individual is more intense in his own desires. Thus we cannot say that strong-willed people are good or weak-willed people are bad. In our way of life and under the existing conditions under which we function, it is assumed that strong-willed people will be more successful, that weak-willed persons lacking intensity, dedication, and continuity, will be less successful. Thus, in the struggle for success, strength of will is regarded as a valuable instrument. It causes the individual to be more ruthless than he would otherwise be. It makes him less considerate of possible damage as he proceeds, and causes him to think of the fulfillment of his own purpose as his one and only objective. Thus, there is something very selfish often about the will procedure. It does not arise usually from a matured consideration of values. It arises from an intense desire to fulfill some personal end or objective. Now, will as a phenomenon is an interesting thing because of the complexities with which it is immediately beset. There is much to indicate that nature does not particularly reward the strong-willed person. Rather, the stronger the will, the more powerful the obstacles which the individual ultimately faces. Great will intensity causes the person to create a number of obstacles for himself and for other persons. Let us imagine the simple situation, which, by the way, is almost completely true. We don't have to do very much fantasy thinking in connection with it. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 billion persons in this world. This does not account for non-human beings that also have wills, because we know that many animals are exceedingly stubborn, many insects exceedingly tenacious. The instinct of continuity is present outside of the human kingdom. But we will assume for a moment that we have 3 billion human beings, each one of which is moving to the fulfillment of the desires of his own willing. In other words, each person is trying to advance his own cause. He is trying to achieve that which he wishes to achieve. And he is pressing harder and harder toward this end until the wish becomes the will. In the process of attempting this, he must inevitably, finally, lock with the collective wills of other persons. Each individual is one out of 3 billion. Against him, all other wills are united. Not because they are opposed to him, but because each is intensely concerned with the fulfillment of itself. You get enough of these willful people, each one working to achieve his own purpose, and the result is universal chaos. Every person's will interferes with the function of every other person's will. All straight lines are lost. As we proceed, for example, in business, we have a will to reach the top. Unfortunately, there are a dozen others with the same determination to reach the top. Each of these individuals, therefore, becomes highly competitive with the others. Some who are less ethical may use every possible subterfuge to outdistance and outwit their competitors. Each one in his own way is resolved to attain the end he desires. And in the confusion of this, the average person's will is hopelessly enmeshed in the common will pressure of his time. There is no evidence whatever that this impulse of the will arises from any particular or separate level of mentation. There is no identity or uniformity in will patterns. There is a certain common method by which will operates, but its objectives differ with each individual. The objectives are also further qualified by various attainments or lack of attainments which distinguish the individual who is willing. Thus, we must assume that will is individual, rising from the individuality of the person, that therefore it is an expression of his own intensities in the furtherance of that which he is, and the gradual motion of that which he is toward that which he wills to be. Over the power of the will, therefore, there has to be some regulating factor. We cannot all do exactly as we will to do. 2 or 3 willful children in a family, and the family is seriously disrupted. All will has to be in some way civilized and socialized. It has to be made suitable for a being living in what we term a socialized system, a society, one in which each person is to a measure dependent upon others, and also must to a degree sacrifice his own ends for the advancement of some larger collective purpose. One of the most difficult things for a will to do is to sacrifice any part of its own purpose. Therefore, even under a so-called civilized system, willfulness is still one of the prevailing phenomena, and also usually one of the most distressing. For in this case of will intensity, the person cheerfully attempts to defraud others of their rightful will participation in some project or activity. If we go back now to our concept of the machine of the sensory perception, we must finally come to the conclusion that the personality, being composed of the sum of its own parts, and these parts variously developed and variously unfolded, working together to form a kind of compound, the personality syndrome. The personality syndrome is ourselves at any given moment. It is the result of exactly what we know and exactly what we do not know. It is not only the result of this general knowing, it is the result of our particular knowing in various areas of activity. Theoretically, this syndrome can only be the sum of the various attainments of the sensory perceptions plus the mental coordinating factor. Brought together by the mental coordinating factor, these elements which constitute the personality syndrome make a final chemical compound. This is a psychochemical compound. It is a compound of attributes, qualities, a compound of abilities and debilities, of likes and dislikes, of refinements and lack of refinements. It represents in its compound all of the mysterious, unequal development which makes the individual the strange being that he is. If, for example, we could see the diagrammatic structure of human beings, we might be considerably astonished. What appears to be a well-organized person, rather tastily attired in a well-fitting draped coat, might be, when considered from the pure standpoint of his inner integration, a rather deformed, lopsided, and asymmetrical creature. We would discover that the various elements of his personality are not harmoniously adjusted. We would also realize that his knowledge is, to use an expression used by Hindus in referring to music, full of holes. That there are strong points where he makes a fair showing and weak points where he makes a miserable showing. Also, that in the various possible patterns into which the personality can develop, the individual may have a definitely unbalanced arrangement of his own personality factors. In most cases, in the development of the average person, the personality represents the intensive progression of a small group of dominant faculties. The subdominants have very little opportunity. Therefore, in any one embodiment, the individual, having selected a dominant, proceeds to more or less take this as a horse takes a bit between its teeth and start to race with this dominant. This dominant seems to offer a number of advantages. First, it offers economic advantage. If the dominant has been fairly well developed, the individual has a particular skill. This particular skill, whether it is in profession or trade, therefore signifies an achievement in which one part of the nature is much more adequately unfolded, developed, or informed than some other part of the nature. Actually, however, in coming down through a long period of time, the individual has been working with many aspects of his own personality. The part which is not being used dominantly at the time in some profession or trade is not dead. It represents a subdominant. And this subdominant very often becomes the basis of psychic disorder. The subdominant, being immediately neglected, having no opportunity to express itself normally, becomes neurotic. Now, it is interesting to consider that a personality, one individual, may have a half a dozen independent, neurotic, subdominant factors in him. We think of the neurotic as just being a compound in which the entire person is frustrated. Actually, this is not usually the case, even in a good, solid example of neurosis. Nearly always, the individual has, however, too large an area of non-expressed factors that do not come into normal usage in daily living. The individual, therefore, has a syndrome that is made up of a family of independent elements. In this family, one or two children have been spoiled. A couple of cantankerous old relatives are constantly interfering. The husband and wife are not entirely compatible. One or two children are neglected. And in all, the family is in poor organization. This poor organization gradually results in various types of psychic pressure developing in the individuals according to their relation to the general family situation. The same occurs within the personality. The individual who has developed himself very well, for example, along lines of banking or medicine or law, finds that he has a profession or a business which is reasonably suitable to support him. Because today, as never before, all forms of business are intensely competitive, it becomes important to this man to continue to advance his knowledge of the particular subject upon which he depends for livelihood. So what happens? The man, for instance, becomes a salesman. First thing you know, he has to attend sales meetings. He is not just a salesman from 9 to 4:30 or 5. That was more or less what he started out to be. But he finds a little later that he has to be a salesman 2-3 evenings a week, learning more about sales technique. He then discovers that someone is liable to outstrip him completely. Therefore, perhaps he has to go back to school and take a course in salesmanship or a refresher, just as the doctor attends frequent conferences and symposia and things of that nature to keep up with the details of his own profession. Little by little, his job takes over his life. By the time he gets through, the dominant factors have completely eclipsed or vampirized all the lesser areas within his nature. And because nature itself is not interested in whether he is a successful banker or not, having no concern over such matters, nature does not support and abet this intense specialization. Man rewards it and nature punishes it. And the individual has to decide who he's going to be with. Now, for most persons have decided that they would rather take a chance and break faith with nature, whose processes are wonderful and mysterious and not very obvious, rather than to take a chance and break with tradition and with present prevailing policy and immediately endanger themselves as to loss and demotion or failure for advancement. So the average person, in making his decisions, has a tendency to sacrifice what he does not understand in favor of that which is immediately useful in some way. He therefore sacrifices the greater for the nearer. He sacrifices what might be termed by him an idealism for an immediate realism. Nature has very little patience with this procedure, however. Nature is interested in the person becoming an adequate human being. Now, as a result of developing very intensely certain aspects of the personality, the individual gradually draws into these selected aspects the greater part of the sustaining power, force, or energy of life. In other words, he supports these dominants with the greatest amount of available libido. He gets behind these faculties, these processes which are making him rich and sick, and gives them everything he's got. As he proceeds to do this, he finds he also has to withdraw energy from other areas. He may have to withdraw so much energy that after what might be considered a reasonably busy day, he may come home, collapse, and go to sleep, and have no further interest in life until the next day. He is simply tired out. He has no longer the energy to develop the various aspects of his nature. Now, this might not be quite so tragic if it was not true that in this procedure he is cheating this thing which we call the mental coordinator. The mental coordinator is now confronted with a situation in which, like a highly specialized machine, the human brain, the mechanical brain, so to say, that this machine is no longer fed authentic data. You expect the IBM machine to produce certain answers, but it cannot produce these answers if the necessary data is not fed into the machine. And when you get an individual who is hobbling along through life on one great specialty and a broken crutch for the rest of his life, he is not able to supply the coordinator with the information necessary to produce a reasonable judgment. All of the elements of perception and reflection which should contribute to judgment have been outwitted, except one or two. Throughout being outwitted and neglected, vast areas of human consciousness are underprivileged, undernourished, and lack any sustaining will or libido to energize them. These other areas, these neglected areas, proceed to bring in inadequate testimony. The individual has no interest, no appreciation in various qualities which are important. When he selects a friend, he selects a man who talks his language. But because in his own nature he has never developed insight, he is unable to cope with the problem of his so-called friend's character. He has no power to read that character. He can only meet the friend on the level of such attainment as he possesses. If he is a physician and his friend is a physician, they meet on the level of medicine. But outside of this, they have no meeting at all. so that the individual simply has a friendship for those qualities which are like his own. He may therefore be bitterly deceived or disillusioned by characteristics which he has no ability to judge. Now, it is true that in the majority of instances we do gain a certain general, not very penetrating insight in areas outside of dominant interests. But I think we can say definitely at the present time that so-called civilized man has one dominant, maybe two or three weak subdominants, and that the rest of his compound nature is little better than a vacuum. There is nothing being contributed. Because of this unbalanced, unreasonable, disordered state of himself, the coordinator must come up with faulty conclusions, must come up with false values, must falsely estimate the meaning of things. The individual looking out through his eyes upon a world sees not what is there, but sees what he has been trained to see. The rest of this world is comparatively invisible. His eyes may record it, that is true, but what they record is meaningless, because he has never energized the areas of himself to understand these things. Thus, one man going out and standing on the side of a mountain overlooking a great scene will be deeply moved by the magnificence of the spectacle. Another man who has climbed to the same height and stands there puffing, without any appreciation of the scene whatever, turns to a friend and says, "If I had been paid to do this, it would have cost $10,000. The person simply had no concern or no consideration for those areas of value which are peculiar to the nature lover. Nature itself, however, doesn't like this. Nature doesn't like to see individuals working from the beginning to the end of life without ever having the experience of a well-balanced attitude. So nature is continuously trying to break down this excessive specialization. One way it tries to break down specialization is its oldest and most basic biological trick, and that is through marriage. It is one way in which nature attempts to prevent the individual from losing contact with most of life. Through marriage and family and children, the individual is forced back into certain realities. He is forced back into the exhibition of his own abilities to cope with immediate circumstances. The atomic engineer suddenly finds himself the father of twins. This is a moment of great crisis. It means that either this man must draw upon his humanity resources within himself, must allow certain human and natural emotions to take over, must gradually divide his attention, or else he is going to be extremely unfair either to his profession or to his family. He must learn, therefore, to carry divided interests with dignity. Another way nature works on this project is through the aging process. By this process, nature itself is constantly forcing the individual into different adjustments with living. The child has one group of adjustments. The adolescent has another. The mature person has still another. The aged still another. Nature is constantly trying to force us to diversify, force us to take various areas of life and enrich them, take various levels of our own intensities and bring these levels into objectivity. If nature succeeds, a certain maturity is thrust upon us by circumstances. If, however, we are too set in our ways, too unchanging in our determination, and too self-centered, we will resent and reject all natural conditions and go headlong into some extraordinary intensity which will ultimately bring us to disaster, because the human nature is not equipped for this kind of monorail existence. We have to diversify in order to live. In this process of diversifying, we begin to break down the intensities of isolated autocratic powers within ourselves. If man has only one dominant interest in life and everything else is neglected, this individual has turned his career over to an autocrat, an absolute tyrant and a complete dictator. He has lost actually all conscious control over his own conduct. Certainly he fulfills the common patterns which are required by society, but he is not developing a personality that is safe for himself or for those around him. If he is going in this direction too far, then his will becomes more and more one-pointed, and his will, focusing upon his principal activity and his principal interest, will and often does cause him to be completely ruthless and to be entirely willing to sacrifice his own health, his own happiness, his own peace of mind, and the securities of those dependent upon him for the mere purpose of fulfilling his own dominant determination. Now, if all these determinations were wonderful and beautiful things, it would not be quite so bad, but this is not the way it is in life. Many of these determinations, which we so vitalize with energy, are not meritorious or commendable. Some of them are simply utter expressions of selfishness. They represent the individual living for the fulfillment of his own desires alone. And these desires usually themselves neither reasonable nor healthy. If the will is available for the continual support of these intensities, the person can move from comparative insignificance to an exceedingly dangerous condition. And most of the world's tyrants, like Adolf Hitler or Napoleon or Genghis Khan or Caesar, were great self-willed vehicles of energy. They were determined to fulfill their own ambitions, and they have left the pages of history red with the blood of the innocent. This type of grand egoism, this egoistic self-will mania, is probably an exaggerated situation. Very few persons in the normal experience of life feel that they are touched by any such extraordinary excess. But many in smaller ways have sacrificed the world in which they lived, sacrificed the immediate things which they should have considered, simply to advance will purpose. Suppose we allow for a moment that the average person in functioning with various situations has built up this machine of the six senses to a degree that it has reasonably or fairly completely integrated the individual in relationship to his environment. We will say that this person, by use of the five senses and the reflective faculties working with the senses, has gradually individualized himself into a person who has derived most of his objectives and his instincts and his appetites from environmental pressures, but nevertheless has gradually integrated into a personality, this personality being the inevitable byproduct of the time, place, and conditions in which the individual lives. It's moved in upon himself very largely. That part of his own nature which might be regarded as greater than the self, or deeper within his own experience than his experience of selfhood, is very seldom given much consideration. In fact, we are inclined to doubt its existence unless we go much more deeply into these matters than the average, even the average scientist of the present day. We are inclined to simply assume that the individual is the sum of his parts, and that these parts have their own origin in environmental pressures, by which certain stimuli are contributed to the central nervous system, which organizes these stimuli into a point of view, or an attitude, or a way of life. And what we call a person is an attitude. It is a summation of pressures, of various traditional procedures, of the testimony of sensory perceptions, and the individual gradually gathering together and reflecting upon those peculiar experiences which are his because of the faculties with which he recorded them. So we have this person. This person has a fair knowledge of mathematics. If he's a recent college graduate, he doesn't know how to spell, but that isn't considered too important because he really doesn't want to learn to spell. He expects to hire a secretary to do that within a year or two. He's going to have a little further trouble, however, when he discovers the secretary can't spell. But this is something we'll come around to in due course. But the individual has a little of the 3 R's, not enough of them. He has a little smattering, maybe, of a language. He has some minor specialization, which he hasn't carried too far. He likes music. He enjoys dancing. He can take a car apart and put it together again. He could do that before he went to school. He can recognize the principal television programs. He has a smattering of taste, good, bad, or indifferent. He has heard a few names. In fact, he has gradually become a name dropper, which is one of the indications of higher education. But he has now reached the point where, out of the fragments and elements of his education, in which he has studied too long and learned too little, he has to form a personality. This personality is further influenced by his family condition, what kind of relatives he had, whether his parents were well suited to each other, all kinds of different phenomenal situations add together to form this thing we call a personality. But having put it together the best way he could, depending upon the coordinator to always bring a state of synthesis, even if there's not too much to synthesize, the person now emerges as a person. He emerges as this mysterious symbol of all that he is and all that he isn't. And he calls this mysterious symbol himself. This self he cannot really explore. He knows in a measure how it was put together. He will never probably know why it was put together. He recognizes that it is composed of separate elements which in various ways can be partly separated but never completely so. He realizes that if some part of this sensory or coordinating structure is disordered, that he is disoriented and may definitely lose his mental coordination. But here he is as a self. Whatever he has, whatever he is, all these together, good and bad, strong and weak, have made him into a person. And there's one thing that he is inordinately proud of, and that is the fact that he is a person. Being a person means that he feels somewhere within himself a center of life. This center of life he dignifies with the term I. And he thinks that whenever he speaks for this center of life, he is speaking in an oracular manner equal to that of the Oracle of Delphi in Greece. Anything that comes out of this self is sacred. If it is not sacred in the theological sense, it is sacred in a psychological sense. This self, some way, is the last recourse. There's nothing beyond it. When an individual says, "This I believe," he is making a statement of small worth but great importance. To have the feeling, to have the sense of selfness, means to have uniqueness. The individual is unique because he has experienced the only self he can experience, and that is a unique experience. If he could experience a dozen other people's selves, he wouldn't be nearly so unique or so awe-stricken with the importance of his own nature. But he can never know any other self than his own. He can talk about other selves. He can observe other people with selves. But he never can have the intimate and immediate experience of being anyone but himself. Thus, to live in a very close association with a mystery for which we have no adequate explanation nearly always leads to a certain hero worship. The individual overestimates the importance of himself. He overestimates the integrity of his own nature. And he overestimates the sphere of influence in which he has a right to occupy. To him, this self is a sovereignty. He has a perfect right under the sun to be lord of all he can get hold of. He has perfect right to push other selves aside, because other selves are not himself. And he in himself is the important thing. Many, many years ago, when I took over the Church of the People around 1921 here in Los Angeles, I inherited it indirectly from its founder, Dr. Benjamin Fay Mills, who was a well-known evangelist. Dr. Mills used to get up in the pulpit quite frequently and make a statement of overwhelming modesty. He said, "If I can't do it, my wife can't do it, and our children can't do it, it can't be done." Now, this is a clear statement of the sublime significance of self. But it is comparatively an advanced statement, inasmuch as Dr. Mills included his family. In most cases, the individual alone must either be able to do it or it cannot be done. I guess it was Christian charity that broadened Dr. Mills. Anyway, he did include his near relatives among those infallible and semi-infallible elements of nature. But the semi-infallible ones were only semi-infallible because they were his. If they'd been anybody else's, they wouldn't have counted. So it all went back finally to this tremendous drive of ego. The individual has no sense within himself of any inadequacy, because he would recognize it. How can inadequacy tag itself? How can inadequacy recognize inadequacy? Because whatever it is the total. And the total can never appear to be inadequate. The individual cannot conceive of any other self that is smarter, brighter, or better than he is. The only thing he can see is that other people have misunderstood him and suspected that other people were brighter than he was. It is all this peculiarly small, closed world in which we live. Also, we sense this self within ourselves as strangely enduring. It seems to have no beginning and end. It has a semi-independence from the body, but we're not quite sure how that operates. We know it has some difference from the body because a man can lose both legs and still be himself, so that it cannot be that his self was deposited in his nether limbs. He has to assume that all of his physical nature, 3/4 of his physical nature, or even a half of a physical nature, is still himself. That there seems to be no diminishment of self. There is also very little indication of diminishment of self in age. Individuals, as they grow older, do not experience the self as growing older. They experience only certain infirmities of the body. The self continues to be timeless in them. And it continues to be their self and alive as long as they are alive. Or at least as long as they are conscious of their own existence. So within us is this thing for which we have no adequate definition, which is doing basic things for which we have no adequate definition, and using energies for which we have no definite or proper and adequate definition. Thus we are founded in a mystery. We are established in a secret which we cannot entirely understand. Yet out of this mystery there is continually pouring into manifestation a series of attitudes. These attitudes we grow up with. They seem perfectly natural to us. Even if these attitudes are strangely twisted and corrupted in the views of other people, to us they are ours, and perfectly all right. These attitudes continually flowing out of us not only cause us to like and dislike variously according to our personalities, but they cause us to react variously to the situations and stimuli of life around us. We develop temperaments, personalities, characters, and dispositions. We have all kinds of moods. We have all kinds of reactions. Even our taste buds are not consistent. One individual likes spinach and another does not. Some individuals like the color blue and some prefer green, and there are not a few that enjoy red better than either. It is the same thing with odors, perfumes, and things of that nature. We have our choices. And in looking at art or great paintings, we are not in agreement as to what is beauty. Listening to music, we are not in agreement as to what is harmony. We assume that all persons upon the same level of attainment would be in harmony. But even this has not always been proved to be true. The only thing we realize and do know is that the more advanced we become in any area of learning, the more patient and tolerant we become. But whether it means a true appreciation or only a sort of resignedness to situations, we are not too certain. But out of this deep, unknown mystery within ourselves, like the auricular vent of Trophonius, comes this something that takes over and tells us that it is ourselves. It tells us that we like this and we do not like that, and we can't stand this and we can't tolerate that. And gradually it comes to our conclusion or our attitude that somewhere in the inside of things is a tyrant that is ruling us arbitrarily without making good sense or anything of that nature. Most of the things that we insist upon doing, we cannot even justify. The only thing is we know we want to do them. And knowing that we want to do them, we quietly inform ourselves that we intend to do them. And it's just too bad for anybody that gets in our way. But we don't know why. We do not know why one morning we are in good temper and the next morning our disposition is entirely foul. We do not know why. We say we must have eaten something, or that perhaps we are running a little acidity or something of that nature, but we don't know why. One writer said that the greatest wars of history have been due to a little too much green bile in the gallbladder. We don't know. But these things strangely seem to emerge from us. Everyone has a different reaction to everything, all due to this mysterious thing within us ourselves, which reacts in a variety of contrary manners, but to which we become entirely accustomed, having learned in some patient manner to always get along with ourselves. Here also lies our greater patriotism, for beyond and above all other allegiances is the allegiance to our own desires. We have to fulfill them. Why? Because we feel like it. Why? because we do not know. Everything disappears into this not knowing. But out of it comes a despotism which apparently is almost beyond calculation. From this unfinished nature of ourselves, therefore, must come this volitional force, the force of the will, which is the continuing pressure of exactly what we are, determining to do exactly what it wills to do. This will does not mean that it arises from any rightness, any certainty, any security, or any value. It simply arises from the immediate compound of the plus and minus factors which have gone together to form a personality. The more aggressive this compound is, the more aggressive the will is going to be. Certain lines of activity have a tendency to be aggressive. The individual who chooses out of the compound of his personality adjustments to be a soldier, a test pilot, an adventurer, choosing hazardous and difficult occupations, certainly has a disposition entirely different from a person who by nature will choose some quiet, peaceful, unobtrusive line of activity. There has to be work for all kinds of people, and there are certainly all kinds of people for the work at hand. And out of the diversity of these different activities, the intricate pattern, much of it charming and delightful, some of it terrifying, the intricate pattern of society has been built up. So we have this rather obvious certainty that not only do these faculties which we possess incline us to professions or trades or arts, but these professions in their own turn are only symbolical of the peculiar intensities of our nature.